My husband had just driven away from our house that morning, tires crunching over the gravel, his taillights disappearing around the bend of Maple Hollow Road, when my daughter tugged on my sleeve, her small fingers trembling, and whispered 3 words that would change the rest of my life: "Mom, run." I froze for half a second, confused, until I saw her eyes, wide and terrified, fixed on something behind me in our own front yard, and that was the moment everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, and my own home shattered into pieces. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the quiet, stubborn hope that even the darkest mornings can turn into something beautiful, then please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who might need it today, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like this one mean so much more when they're shared within a community that still believes people can change, that families can heal, and that love, real love, is always worth fighting for. Now, let me take you back to that morning, because to understand what my daughter saw, and why she said what she said, you need to understand who we were before that day, and how we got there. My name is Rachel Whitfield, and for 11 years I was married to a man named Gregory Turner, a man I met in a coffee shop in a small town called Belmont Creek when I was 26 years old and still believed the world was mostly good. Gregory was charming in those days, the kind of charming that made waitresses laugh and made his coworkers trust him with the office keys. He had broad shoulders and an easy smile, and when he looked at me across that coffee shop counter, I felt, for the first time in my adult life, like someone had finally seen me. I had grown up the middle child of 5, overlooked more often than not, the one who packed her own lunches and signed her own permission slips because my parents were always occupied with somebody else's crisis. Gregory's attention felt like sunlight after a long winter, and I fell for him quickly, perhaps too quickly, the way people do when they mistake being noticed for being loved. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony behind my grandmother's farmhouse, under an oak tree that had stood there for over a century, and I remember thinking, as I walked down that makeshift aisle in my mother's altered wedding dress, that I had finally found the person who would make sure I was never invisible again. For the first few years, that felt true. Gregory worked as a regional sales manager for a company that distributed farm equipment, and I taught 3rd grade at Belmont Creek Elementary, and our life together had the comfortable rhythm of 2 people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. We bought a house on the edge of town, a modest 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a big maple tree in the backyard, and 3 years into our marriage, our daughter Josephine was born. Josephine, whom we called Josie from the very first week because Josephine felt too formal for someone so small and fierce, changed everything about how I saw the world. I had never known love like that, love that rearranged your priorities without asking permission, love that made you terrified and brave in the same breath. Gregory was a good father in those early years, or at least he tried to be, though I noticed even then that his patience wore thin faster than mine did, that he would grow irritable when Josie cried too long, that he sometimes left the room when things got hard rather than staying to work through them. I told myself this was normal, that all new fathers struggled, that he would grow into it. I realize now, already making excuses for him before I fully understood what I was excusing. The cracks in our marriage did not appear all at once. They crept in slowly, the way water seeps into a foundation long before anyone notices the walls beginning to lean. Gregory's job required him to travel 3 or 4 days a week, visiting farm supply stores and equipment dealers across 2 states, and somewhere around Josie's 4th birthday, I began to notice that he came home different. Distracted. Short-tempered over things that had never bothered him before, the way I loaded the dishwasher, the sound of the television, the fact that Josie wanted him to read her a bedtime story when he was tired. He started staying later on his trips, sometimes not returning until Sunday evening instead of Saturday afternoon, and when I asked him about it, he would say the roads were bad, or a client meeting ran long, or he needed a night to himself after a hard week. I believed him, mostly because I wanted to, and partly because I didn't yet have the language or the evidence to believe anything else. It was Josie, in her own small and unknowing way, who first planted the seed of doubt in me. She was 6 years old, and one evening after Gregory returned from a trip, she asked him, with the guileless honesty that only children possess, why the lady at the restaurant called him sweetheart. Gregory laughed it off, said Josie must have misheard, said children imagine all sorts of things, and I let it go because I did not want it to be true. But the seed had been planted, and over the following 2 years, it grew roots I could not ignore. I found charges on our credit card statement for hotels in towns that were nowhere near his sales route. I found a second phone charger in his car that did not match either of our phones. I found, eventually, on a Tuesday afternoon when I was searching for a spare set of keys, a small velvet box tucked into the back of his sock drawer, containing a bracelet I had never seen him wear on my wrist, with an inscription inside that read, "To see, forever yours." I confronted him that night after Josie had gone to sleep, and I remember my hands shaking as I held that bracelet out to him, my voice barely a whisper because I was afraid that if I spoke too loudly, I would shatter completely. Gregory did not deny it. He did not even try. He told me her name was Colleen, that she managed one of the dealerships he visited in a town 3 hours away, that it had been going on for over a year, and that he was, in his words, not sure what he wanted anymore. I remember the strange, cold clarity that settled over me in that moment, the way grief sometimes arrives not as a scream but as a terrible, quiet stillness. I did not cry that night. I simply asked him to leave, and he did, packing a duffel bag and driving away into the dark while I sat on the edge of our bed and listened to Josie's soft breathing through the baby monitor we had never taken out of her room, even though she was 8 years old by then. What followed was 18 months of a separation that never quite became a divorce, because Gregory, to my surprise, did not disappear the way I expected him to. He rented a small apartment across town, and though the affair with Colleen continued for a time, something in him seemed to fracture when he realized the full weight of what he had broken. He began showing up, unannounced at first, to see Josie, standing awkwardly on the porch of the house he used to live in, asking if he could take her for ice cream or to the park. I let him, not for his sake, but because Josie loved her father despite everything, and I refused to let my own pain become a wall between them. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to change. He started seeing a counselor, something I never imagined the old Gregory would have agreed to. He ended things with Colleen, not because I demanded it, but because, as he told me much later, he looked at himself one morning in the mirror of that empty apartment and did not recognize the man staring back. I want to be honest with you, because this is not a simple story about a villain and a victim, and I think stories like that do a disservice to how complicated real forgiveness actually is. There were months during that separation when I hated Gregory with a ferocity that frightened me, when I lay awake constructing elaborate fantasies of revenge, when I looked at Josie's face, which had his eyes and his stubborn chin, and felt a flash of resentment I was immediately ashamed of. There were other months when I missed him so badly it felt like a physical wound, when I would reach for his side of the bed out of habit and find only cold sheets, when I would hear a car in the driveway and my heart would leap before I remembered he no longer lived there. Grief for a marriage is not a straight line. It loops back on itself. It ambushes you in grocery stores and at parent-teacher conferences and in the particular way afternoon light falls across an empty kitchen table. What ultimately brought us back together, slowly and carefully, was not a single dramatic gesture but 1,000 small ones. Gregory began coming to Josie's school events and sitting in the back, never pushing himself forward, never expecting anything from me beyond civility. He started sending me articles about co-parenting, then, much later, articles about marriage counseling, always with a note that said something like, "No pressure, just thought this might help, whatever we decide." He got a job that required far less travel, taking a pay cut to work as an equipment inspector based entirely in Belmont Creek, a decision he made, he told me, before he even knew if I would ever let him back into our lives, because he wanted to prove to himself, not just to me, that he could choose differently. He wrote me letters, actual handwritten letters, which he left in our mailbox rather than handing to me directly, giving me the space to read them alone and decide how I felt without the pressure of his face watching mine. I did not forgive him quickly, and I want to say clearly, for anyone listening who is walking through something similar, that forgiveness is not a single decision you make once and then never think about again. It is a practice, something you choose again and again, sometimes daily, sometimes hourly, especially in the beginning. There were setbacks. There was a night, about a year into our separation, when I saw a photo on social media of Gregory at a restaurant with a woman I didn't recognize, and the old wound tore open so violently that I did not speak to him for 3 weeks, even though it turned out the woman was his cousin visiting from out of state. There was a Christmas when Josie asked, with the devastating simplicity children have, why Santa couldn't just bring Daddy home for good, and I had to leave the room so she wouldn't see me cry. But slowly, the trust began to rebuild, not because Gregory demanded it or because I forced myself to pretend everything was fine, but because he consistently, patiently, showed me over many months that he had actually changed, not just performed change for an audience. Counseling helped both of us understand things about our marriage that I had never had the vocabulary for before, the way I had learned to equate his attention with my worth, the way he had learned to run from discomfort instead of sitting with it, the way both of our childhoods had shaped patterns we were only now, as adults, beginning to recognize and interrupt. We moved back in together 14 months after he left, cautiously, with new rules and new honesty between us, and though the scar tissue of that betrayal never fully disappeared, something new and sturdier grew in its place, a marriage built not on the naive assumption that nothing bad would ever happen, but on the harder, more resilient understanding that love sometimes means choosing each other again after everything has already gone wrong once. That was 4 years ago. Josie is 12 now, and in the time since Gregory came home, our life had settled into something I genuinely cherished, imperfect but real, ordinary in the way that only feels precious once you've nearly lost it. Gregory coached Josie's youth soccer team on Saturday mornings. I had gone back to school part-time to finish a master's degree in education administration, something I had put off for years. We had built, brick by careful brick, a family that felt, finally, unshakable. Which brings me back to that Tuesday morning, the one I started this story with, the morning that Gregory drove away down Maple Hollow Road on his way to inspect a grain elevator 2 counties over, the morning my daughter grabbed my sleeve on our front porch and whispered, "Mom, run." It had started as an entirely unremarkable morning. I had made pancakes because Josie had a math test that day and I always made pancakes on test days, a small superstition that had somehow become tradition. Gregory had kissed us both goodbye at the door, lingering a moment longer with Josie to remind her that 7 times 8 was 56, a number she always seemed to forget under pressure. I remember the ordinary sweetness of that moment, him crouched down to her eye level, her giggling at his exaggerated seriousness, the morning light slanting gold across our porch steps. He climbed into his truck, backed out of the driveway, and I stood there with Josie, waving, the way we always did, until his taillights vanished around the bend where Maple Hollow Road curved past the old Kessler farm. I was about to turn back toward the house to grab Josie's backpack when I felt her hand close around my sleeve, and I looked down to find her face had gone pale, her eyes fixed on something over my shoulder, in the direction of our own backyard. "Mom," she said again, barely audible, "run." I turned, and for one disorienting moment, I could not make sense of what I was seeing. There, at the edge of our property, near the tree line that separated our yard from the wooded ravine behind it, stood a man I did not recognize, tall and unshaven, wearing a filthy jacket despite the warm morning, standing utterly still and staring directly at us with an expression I can only describe as hollow. He was not moving toward us, not yet, but something about his stillness was somehow more frightening than if he had been running at us, and I understood, with the sudden clarity that comes only in moments of real danger, exactly why Josie had gone so still and pale. I grabbed her hand and we moved quickly toward the house, not running exactly, because some instinct told me not to make sudden panicked movements, but walking with the fast, purposeful urgency of a mother whose entire being had narrowed down to one single objective, getting her child somewhere safe. I got us both inside and locked the door, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 attempts to turn the deadbolt, and I pulled Josie away from the windows, my mind racing through every possibility, wondering if I should call Gregory, wondering if I should call the police first, wondering if this man had followed us here or simply wandered onto our property, wondering, with a fear that made my stomach drop, whether he had been watching our house before this morning, whether he had waited specifically for Gregory to leave. I called 911 with trembling fingers, my voice cracking as I tried to explain to the dispatcher what we had seen, a strange man on our property, staring at us, refusing to move, and she kept me on the line, calm and steady, asking me questions, telling me units were on the way, telling me to stay inside, stay away from windows and doors, keep my daughter close. Josie had wrapped herself around my waist, her face pressed into my side, and I could feel her whole small body trembling, and in that moment, every instinct I had as a mother rose up in me like a wall, fierce and absolute, because nothing in this world, not even the wreckage of what our marriage had survived, mattered more to me than keeping this child safe. The minutes we waited for the police to arrive felt endless, the kind of stretched, elastic time that only exists in moments of true fear. I kept Josie away from the windows but could not resist glancing out myself, and each time I did, the man was still there, at the edge of the yard, not approaching, simply standing, watching our house with an unnerving patience. I tried calling Gregory, but his phone went straight to voicemail, likely because he was already out of cell range on the rural stretch of road that led to the grain elevator site, and the helplessness of not being able to reach him, of facing this alone with only my frightened daughter beside me, made the fear claw even harder at my chest. It was perhaps 12 minutes later, though it felt like an hour, when I heard the sound of tires on gravel, and my heart leapt with the hope that it was the police, but through the front window I saw instead Gregory's truck pulling back into the driveway at a speed far too fast for our quiet street, the tires kicking up dust as he threw the truck into park before it had even fully stopped. I watched him climb out and run toward the house, and I understood immediately what had happened, that he must have realized somewhere down the road that he'd forgotten something, or that some instinct of his own had nagged at him, and he had turned around. He burst through the door calling our names, and I told him quickly what we had seen, pointing toward the backyard, and I watched his face shift from confusion to alarm to something harder, something protective, as he moved past us toward the back door. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because this moment, more than almost any other in our marriage, showed me how completely Gregory had changed from the man who once ran from difficulty rather than facing it. The old Gregory, the one who avoided hard conversations, who left the room when things got uncomfortable, who chose the path of least resistance even when it cost the people he loved, would not have been the man who threw his truck into reverse the second some unexplainable unease crossed his mind on a rural highway. But this Gregory, for years and 1,000 small choices later, had turned that truck around because some part of him, some instinct sharpened by years of learning to pay attention rather than run from it, told him something was wrong, and he had trusted that instinct enough to act on it immediately. He did not go outside, to my relief, because by then we could hear sirens approaching, and instead he stayed with us, positioning himself between the back door and where Josie and I stood, his body tense and alert in a way I had never seen before. When the police arrived, 2 officers moved carefully around the perimeter of our property while Gregory spoke with a third at the front door, and within a few minutes, they had located the man near the tree line and were speaking with him. I watched from the window, still holding Josie close, as the situation unfolded, and I saw something in the officer's body language shift from caution to something gentler, and eventually one of them walked back toward our house to explain. The man's name, we would later learn, was Walter Higgins, a 58-year-old veteran who lived alone in a small house about 2 miles down the ravine trail that ran behind several properties on our street, including ours. He suffered, the officer explained carefully, from a combination of PTSD and early-onset dementia, conditions that sometimes caused him to become disoriented and to wander from his home, occasionally for hours at a time, without full awareness of where he was or why. His neighbors and a home health aide who checked on him twice a week had apparently called in a missing person report about 90 minutes before our own call, worried because he had not answered his door for his morning check-in. He had wandered along the ravine trail and ended up on our property, and in his confused state, he had simply stopped and stood there, not out of any malicious intent, but because some part of his mind, perhaps caught in a memory or a fog he could not navigate his way out of, had frozen him in place. I felt an overwhelming, disorienting rush of relief followed almost immediately by a wave of guilt and sorrow that surprised me with its intensity. This man was not a predator, not a threat in the way my fear-flooded mind had imagined during those terrifying minutes. He was someone's father, someone's neighbor, a man who had served his country and was now lost, quite literally, in the fog of his own deteriorating mind, wandering onto a stranger's property because he no longer had the cognitive clarity to find his own way home. The officer told us that Walter's daughter, a woman named Patricia who lived about 40 minutes away and had been trying for months to convince her father to move into a care facility, had been called and was on her way. I asked if I could see him, and the officer, somewhat surprised by the request, said it should be fine, since Walter was calm now and clearly not a danger, simply confused and, as I would soon see for myself, deeply embarrassed and frightened by what had happened. I walked out to the edge of our yard, leaving Josie with Gregory, who watched me go with a look of concern but did not stop me, and I found Walter sitting now on an overturned bucket near the tree line, an officer crouched beside him speaking gently, and when I approached, Walter looked up at me with eyes that were, I realized with a pang I had not expected, more frightened than I had been. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raspy and uncertain, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. "I don't know how I got here. I was looking for my wife. She used to garden right about here, I thought, but I don't think that's right, is it? This isn't our place." His confusion was heartbreaking to witness up close, the way his mind seemed to be reaching for a memory that kept dissolving before he could grasp it, and I understood in that moment that fear, real fear, can look identical whether it comes from malice or from a broken mind desperately searching for solid ground. I knelt down near him, keeping a respectful distance but wanting him to know I was not angry, and I told him gently that it was all right, that he had simply gotten a little turned around, that his daughter was on her way to help him home. Something in his face softened at that, a flicker of relief crossing his weathered features, and he nodded slowly, though I could see the shame still sitting heavy on him. Patricia arrived about 20 minutes later, rushing across our lawn with tears already streaming down her face, apologizing profusely to Gregory and me even as she wrapped her arms around her father, who seemed to recognize her instantly and clung to her with the desperate relief of someone finally finding familiar ground after being lost in unfamiliar territory. She explained, once she had settled her father into her car, that this was not the first time this had happened, that she had been fighting with him for over a year about moving somewhere safer, somewhere with supervision, but that he was proud and stubborn and insisted he could manage on his own, the way he always had since her mother passed away 3 years earlier. She said the words that broke something open in my chest, that she was terrified something like this would end badly one day, that her father would wander onto the wrong property at the wrong moment and someone frightened for their own safety would react in a way that hurt him, simply because fear, in an instant, does not stop to ask questions. I told her I understood, and I meant it more deeply than she probably realized, because in those terrifying minutes before we knew the truth, my own mind had raced through worst-case scenarios, had considered whether I needed a weapon in the house, had felt a surge of protective fury that, had circumstances been slightly different, could have led to a tragedy neither of us would have wanted. It was a sobering realization, that the line between a frightened family protecting itself and an innocent, vulnerable man being harmed by that very fear was thinner than I had ever fully appreciated before that morning. After Patricia and Walter left, promising to follow up and thanking us again for our patience and kindness, Gregory and I sat down at our kitchen table with Josie between us, all three of us still processing the adrenaline that had flooded through our small household in the span of less than an hour. Josie, who had been remarkably brave throughout the ordeal, finally allowed herself to cry, the tears she had been holding back spilling over now that the immediate danger had passed, and Gregory pulled her into his lap the way he used to when she was small, murmuring reassurances into her hair while I sat across from them, my own hand still not quite steady around my coffee mug. It was Josie, in the quiet aftermath, who asked the question that would end up shaping the rest of that day and, in many ways, the weeks that followed. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked, wiping her eyes. "That man. Is someone going to take care of him now?" I told her I hoped so, that his daughter seemed to love him very much and was trying to find the right kind of help, and Josie nodded, but I could see something working behind her eyes, some 12-year-old processing of the morning's events that was clearly more complicated than simple relief that the danger had passed. "I was so scared," she admitted quietly. "I thought he was going to hurt us. But he was just lost, wasn't he? He was just an old man who was lost and scared too." There was something remarkable in her ability, even at 12, even fresh from genuine terror, to hold both truths at once, that her fear had been valid and real, and that the object of that fear had turned out to be someone deserving of compassion rather than condemnation. I looked at Gregory over her head, and I saw in his eyes the same thought that was forming in mine, that our daughter, in this single frightening morning, had somehow absorbed a lesson about the world that many adults spend a lifetime failing to learn, that fear and compassion are not mutually exclusive, that you can protect yourself fiercely while still recognizing the humanity of the person who frightened you, that the world is rarely as simple as threats and safety, villains and victims, but is instead populated mostly by people carrying burdens you cannot see from the outside. Gregory did not go back to work that day. He called his supervisor and explained what had happened, and though it meant losing a day's wages, he stayed home with us, and the three of us spent the rest of that morning simply being together in the quiet, grateful way that people are together after surviving something frightening, even when that fear had ultimately resolved into something closer to sorrow than danger. We ordered pizza for lunch even though it was only 11 in the morning, because none of us wanted to cook, and we sat in the living room with the television on but not really watching it, each of us occasionally reaching out to touch one another, a hand on a shoulder, an arm around a waist, small physical reassurances that we were all still here, all still safe, all still together. It was later that afternoon, while Josie was upstairs finishing her homework, having decided she still wanted to take her math test the next day rather than ask to postpone it, that Gregory and I sat together on the back porch, looking out at the same tree line where Walter had stood that morning, and had one of the most honest conversations we had shared in years. He told me that when he had been driving down Maple Hollow Road that morning, something had nagged at him, not a clear thought, just an unsettled feeling in his gut, and that he had almost dismissed it, almost kept driving toward the grain elevator, the way the old version of himself might have, prioritizing the job, the schedule, the path of least resistance. But he said that somewhere in the last 4 years, in all the therapy and the hard conversations and the slow rebuilding of trust between us, he had learned to listen to those instincts instead of silencing them, to trust that his gut feelings about the people he loved deserved his attention even when they were inconvenient. "I used to run from things," he said quietly, staring out at the ravine where the trees swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Discomfort, fear, anything that felt hard. I ran toward easier things instead, easier feelings, easier people. And today, for 1 second on that road, I felt that same pull, the pull to just keep driving, to tell myself I was being paranoid, that everything was fine. But I didn't listen to it. I turned around instead. And I think that's the difference, Rachel. That's the whole difference between who I used to be and who I'm trying to be now. It's not that I don't still feel that pull sometimes. It's that I don't follow it anymore. I reached over and took his hand, and we sat there for a long while in silence, the kind of silence that does not need to be filled with words because the understanding between two people has grown deep enough to hold it. I thought about Walter Higgins often in the days that followed, and I reached out to Patricia a week later, partly out of genuine concern and partly because I felt, in some way I could not fully articulate, that our families had been connected by that frightening morning in a way that deserved follow-up rather than simply fading into memory. Patricia told me that the incident, frightening as it had been for all of us, had finally convinced her father that he needed more support than he could manage alone, and that he had agreed, somewhat reluctantly but without the fierce resistance he had shown before, to move into a memory care community about 15 minutes from Patricia's home, a place with structured activities and staff trained specifically to help residents like him, a place where he would be safe and where his daughter would no longer have to live with the constant fear of a phone call telling her he had wandered off and could not find his way back. I asked if I could visit sometime, and Patricia, surprised and touched by the offer, said her father would probably enjoy that he had mentioned Josie's kindness to him more than once in the days since, describing her, in his sometimes foggy recollection, as the brave little girl who wasn't scared of an old man, which was not quite accurate but was, I thought, its own kind of truth, the way memory sometimes preserves the emotional core of an experience even when it loses the precise details. Josie and I did visit, about a month later, bringing a small potted plant because Patricia had mentioned her father used to love gardening before his diagnosis made it too difficult to manage safely, and Walter, though he did not fully remember the specifics of that frightening morning on our property, greeted us with a warmth that suggested some part of him recognized us as people who had been kind to him during a moment when he had been lost and afraid. That visit became the first of several, not frequent, but regular enough that Josie began asking, every few weeks, whether we could go see the gardening man, and I found myself genuinely looking forward to those visits too, sitting with Walter in the small courtyard of his care community, listening to him talk about a garden he used to keep with his late wife. A garden that existed now mostly in fragments and echoes in his mind, but that clearly still brought him joy to describe, even imperfectly. There was something healing, I think, for all of us in those visits, a way of transforming what had been one of the most frightening mornings of our family's recent life into something that instead became a bridge toward a different kind of relationship, one built not on fear but on the recognition that even strangers, even people who cross our paths in frightening circumstances, are carrying their own stories, their own losses, their own quiet battles that deserve compassion rather than judgment. I have thought a great deal, in the months since that morning, about the strange symmetry of what happened to us. For years earlier, I had faced a different kind of fear in my own life, the fear of a marriage I thought I understood collapsing into something unrecognizable, the fear of discovering that the person I trusted most had been living a double life I never suspected. I had faced, in Gregory's betrayal, a version of being lost too, lost in my own home, lost in a version of my life I no longer recognized, uncertain how to find my way back to safety and stability and trust. And just as Walter had eventually found his way home, guided by his daughter's persistence and love even when he resisted it, I too had found my way back to something resembling home, guided by Gregory's slow, consistent, patient effort to become someone worthy of the trust he had broken, and by my own willingness, hard-won and imperfect, to extend forgiveness even when every instinct told me it might be foolish to do so. I do not say this to suggest that every betrayal deserves forgiveness, or that every broken trust can or should be rebuilt. I know, from friends and from stories I have heard over the years, that sometimes the most loving and courageous thing a person can do is walk away for good, and I would never tell anyone listening to this story that they owe forgiveness to someone who has hurt them, especially if that person has shown no genuine change, no real remorse, no consistent effort to become someone different. Forgiveness that is demanded rather than earned is not healing, it is simply another form of harm. But I do believe, having lived through both the devastation of betrayal and the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding, that when someone shows you, not through words but through years of consistent action, that they have genuinely changed, there can be a kind of grace in choosing to believe them, in choosing to let the relationship become something new rather than either pretending the wound never happened or letting that wound define everything that comes after. That morning on Maple Hollow Road taught me something else too, something about the nature of fear itself, and how easily it can distort our perception of the people and situations around us. When Josie whispered, "Mom, run," she was responding to a very real, very valid instinct, the same instinct that has protected human beings for as long as we have existed, the instinct to recognize danger and move away from it. That instinct was not wrong to fire, it would have been wrong to ignore it, wrong to walk calmly toward an unknown man standing motionless at the edge of our property without first ensuring our safety. But the fuller truth of that morning, the truth that emerged only after the immediate fear had passed, was that the situation was more complicated, more human, more deserving of compassion than our initial fear could have told us in that first terrifying moment. I think this is true of so much in life, that our first instinct, our fear response, exists to protect us, and we should honor it. We should never feel ashamed for feeling afraid or for taking steps to keep ourselves and the people we love safe. But I also think that fear, left unexamined, left unpaired with curiosity and compassion once the immediate danger has passed, can calcify into something that keeps us from ever seeing the fuller, more complicated humanity of the people and situations we encounter. Josie, in the months since that morning, has talked about becoming a nurse, specifically someone who works with elderly patients, a career aspiration she did not have before that frightening Tuesday, but that seems to have grown directly out of her experience of watching fear transform into compassion, of watching a man she initially perceived as a threat reveal himself to be someone vulnerable and lost and deserving of gentleness. I do not know if that aspiration will last into adulthood, the way childhood dreams sometimes do and sometimes do not, but I find something deeply moving in the fact that one of the most frightening mornings of her young life became, through the alchemy of time and understanding and her own remarkably open heart, a source of purpose rather than simply a source of trauma. Gregory and I, too, emerged from that morning changed in ways I am still discovering. There is a particular kind of intimacy that grows between two people who have faced fear together and found their way through it, a shorthand of understanding that does not require extensive explanation, and I noticed, in the weeks after Walter Higgins wandered onto our property, that Gregory and I began talking more openly than we had in months about the ongoing work of our marriage, about the ways we still sometimes fell into old patterns, about the small daily choices that either build trust or erode it. The crisis of that morning, frightening as it was, seemed to have reminded both of us, in a visceral way that ordinary life rarely does, how quickly everything we have built together could be taken from us, and how precious the ordinary, unremarkable days of our life together truly were. I think often, too, about Patricia, Walter's daughter, and the years she spent fighting a losing battle to convince her stubborn, proud father to accept the help he needed, watching him decline in ways both visible and invisible, carrying the particular grief of losing someone slowly, piece by piece, while he is still alive to witness his own diminishment. She told me, during one of our visits, that the hardest part was not the practical challenges of caring for a parent with dementia, difficult as those were, but the emotional whiplash of loving someone who sometimes did not fully recognize her, who occasionally called her by her late mother's name, who sometimes seemed present and sharp and entirely himself, and other times seemed to be receding into a fog she could not follow him into. I found myself thinking about how much courage that kind of caregiving requires, a courage that rarely gets celebrated or even noticed by the wider world, the quiet, unglamorous heroism of showing up day after day for someone who cannot always show up for you in return. If this story has touched something in you, I want to ask you to take a moment now, before we reach the end, to think about what it means to you. This idea of fear giving way to compassion, of forgiveness being earned rather than assumed, of second chances being real and possible even after genuine betrayal, so long as they are met with genuine change. I would love for you to leave a comment sharing what part of this story resonated most with you, whether it was Josie's remarkable capacity for compassion even in the midst of her own fear, or Gregory's slow, hard-won transformation from a man who ran from difficulty to a man who turned his truck around because some instinct told him his family needed him, or Walter's daughter Patricia, who loved her father fiercely even when loving him meant making painful decisions he resisted, or perhaps simply the reminder that the people who frighten us in a given moment often carry stories and struggles we cannot see. Whatever part of this story spoke to you, I would be so grateful if you shared it in the comments below, because these stories become so much richer when we hear from each other, when a community of people gathers together to reflect on what it means to be human, to be afraid, to forgive, and to hope. It has been 8 months now since that Tuesday morning on Maple Hollow Road, and our life has largely returned to its ordinary rhythms, the rhythms I have come to treasure precisely because I know, in a way I did not fully understand before, how fragile and precious ordinary days truly are. Gregory still coaches Josie's soccer team, though she has grown taller and faster over the past year, developing a competitive fire that makes him equal parts proud and exhausted. I finished my master's degree in the spring and have taken on a new role as an assistant principal at a school 2 towns over, a professional milestone that felt, in its own quiet way, like another form of the second chance I had been given, proof that a life interrupted by heartbreak can still grow into something you are proud of. We still visit Walter Higgins every few weeks, and though his memory continues its slow decline, there are still moments, bright and clear, when he remembers our names, when he asks about Josie's soccer games, when he tells the same story about a garden he once kept with a woman he loved for 40 years, a story that, though it repeats, still carries within it the unmistakable shape of a life well loved. I think about that morning often, not with the sharp fear that once accompanied the memory, but with a kind of quiet gratitude, because it reminded me, in the space of a single terrifying hour, of everything that truly mattered, the fierce, protective love I feel for my daughter, the hard-won trust one have rebuilt with my husband, and the surprising grace that can emerge when we choose to meet fear with compassion rather than letting it calcify into permanent suspicion. My daughter's whispered warning that morning, "Mom, run," was born of instinct, of a child's raw and valid fear, and I will never fault her for that instinct, because it is exactly the kind of vigilance that keeps us safe in a world that is sometimes genuinely dangerous. But the fuller story of that morning, the story that unfolded in the hours and weeks and months afterward, taught all three of us something perhaps even more valuable than vigilance, that the world is populated not simply by threats to be avoided but by fellow human beings carrying burdens we cannot always see, and that when we allow ourselves to look past our initial fear, we often find not danger but simply another person, lost and searching, just as we all sometimes are, for their way back home. If this story touched your heart even a little, I hope you will like this video, leave a meaningful comment about the lesson or emotion that stayed with you, share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder today that fear and compassion can coexist, that broken trust can sometimes be rebuilt through genuine, sustained effort, and that second chances, though never guaranteed and never something anyone is owed, can become something beautiful when they are met with real change and real grace. And if you believe, as I have come to believe more deeply than ever, in kindness, in forgiveness, in hope, and in the quiet possibility of second chances, please subscribe to our channel, because these are the stories our community was built to share, stories that remind us, again and again, that even our most frightening mornings can become, in time, the doorway to something unexpectedly tender, something that teaches us how to love more fully, forgive more freely, and hold each other just a little closer, for as long as we are lucky enough to have each other at all.